The police have to build on trust, and the papers will print a page about one bad policeman and never mention the thousands who do their job honestly. When we find a bad one, we're down on him like a ton of bricks. Well, I've got to be on my way. See you next week. Ta-da.
And as you rejoin us, the situation is that Plowman 5 was a faller back there at the water jump. Did he fall or was he pushed? Well, we'll never know. So there's only 4 in it now, 4 in a line with 25 acres to go. But meanwhile, it's over to some marvellous and exciting embroidery.
Welcome to the BBC embroidery workout interlude. Just thread your needle and here we go. It's aerobics for the fingers. Ready, ladies? Go for the burn, bend those knuckles, and down, and up, and down, and up, and down.
Here we are, as you may have recognized, at the gates of Pinewood Studios.
No, Eamon, love.
Inside the...
Eamon, it's the Lime Grove story, love. This is... Can someone tell him he's outside the wrong sign?
And most of the people have gone home. But some
Let the burner get down there and tell him.
With black
Will somebody tell him?
shiny limousines.
Maureen, get me some tea, would you?
There's no... for one particular car.
Eamon! He can't hear me, can he?
This corridor is in the...
That's right, you're in the right building now, Eamon. Lime Grove Studios, yes.
Now, when was the idea
Now come
born?
forward into the light, Eamon.
Perhaps the answer lies
Find your
in
light, love.
variety.
Oh,
Perhaps
this
you've
is
just
hopeless.
seen it in the news.
Mention the programmes,
No,
love,
we
that's it.
didn't interrupt
Tonight
it,
came
but
from
it's
here, Muffin the
famous
Mule,
this evening.
Panorama, News Night.
famous
It's the
room
big
was
documentary,
invited
Eamon,
for
your
a
big
very
moment.
private celebration.
Ludovic Kennedy's going to present it. Tell
so are
Ludo
we.
he's a big... Oh, the
Lime
door's
Grove
closed. No, it's open.
Studios.
Away you go,
This
Eamon.
is your knife.
Eamon,
I mean,
love.
wife. No,
Where's he gone?
Can we go back to the shiny black limousines? I like that bit the best.
Lime Grove is one of the most exciting places you could think of in the United Kingdom. It's where it was all at. It was where it was all happening.
I think it's time they put a bomb under the building or pulled it down, because it really was a ghastly place to work. Extremely uncomfortable, horribly overcrowded rooms, hot in the summer.
Lime Grove is such a shambles today, and it always was a shambles. I mean, it was always a pathetic old pile. But Lime Grove was the womb.
It had got character, it had got atmosphere. It's exciting coming here. Not like these ghastly places we have to go to now. Inhuman they are.
I've always been frightened of it. I've always rather hated it, as a matter of fact. It always reminded me of school. Too many prefects.
Here, in the Lime Grove studio, we're waiting for the first result.
I will bid you good night, and our next night will be on Monday.
I'm not going to take part in that game to satisfy a television panel.
Air-conditioned nights there where we wait. And on that basis, if the whole country behaves like that, a swing of between 2 and 2.5...
You accept that, do you? No, I don't. I'm sorry, it was.
One of yesterday's men. One of yesterday's men.
Dick Muffin waves his tail. He rounds them up and he tracks them down, follows them round and round the town, wearing a most important crown. Dick Muffin's on the trail.
For those of us who used to work here, the deserted offices and studios of this hideous building are full of ghosts. For 10 years, during the 1950s, it was where all BBC television programs originated. The bridge between the village hall atmosphere of Alexandra Palace and the smooth professionalism of the television centre. Later, it became the home of BBC Current Affairs. Those of us who were here in the early days were, in a sense, pioneers, experimenters, skeptics, working at a time of rapid change, a change in which the deeply conservative BBC was transformed, much against its will, from being an organ of total conformity to one of non-conformity. It was in 1949 that BBC Television bought Lime Grove, almost in a fit of absent-mindedness.
There was a great deal of opposition to it. I've got some old memos here. There's one here, for example, to the Director of Administration from Norman Collins, who was the boss man, the controller of television at the time. And he says, talking about Lime Grove, the design of the building, with no studios on the ground floor, 3 studios on the first floor, and 2 on the second floor, is, however, such that it is absolutely unideal. And he goes on to say, the attached photograph is more than a little flattering, because it's been taken by trick photography. And in reality, the studios are in a highly congested and built-up area. And with your agreement, I think that we can finally write off these premises as being of no interest to us.
Lime Grove, Shepherd's Bush, the spacious Gainsborough studios, which, as announced on Wednesday, have been bought by the BBC as an additional studio centre for television. Television producers are eagerly looking forward to working in these studios as soon as possible.
Television as such was regarded with what might be called high-minded hostility by Broadcasting House. There's no question about that. And who is to say that they were totally mistaken in that the view was that a visual culture carries very, very great danger. That civilization is an advance from the cave drawings at Altamira and Lascaux to a composite written language. And now television is reversing the advance, and we're going back to the cave dwellings of Altamira and Lascaux.
Another amusing memo, calling of artists from dressing rooms. An artist required on the set for rehearsal can get lost for 20 minutes or so fairly easily. And while call boys or secretaries can be sent looking for them, they get lost too in the search.
Muffin the Mule was a much-loved character of a children's programme of the time. And it was a gala programme for children that was the first to go out from Lime Grove when the studios were officially opened in May 1950 by Mrs. Attlee, wife of the Prime Minister.
It's always exciting to be at the beginning of anything new. Perhaps in years to come, you'll be telling your children how you saw the first children's hour ever to be televised from Lime Grove Studios. This large studio is going to be used solely for your programs. Your program is going to be so varied that there's sure to be something that will interest each one of you.
This is our percussion band. Yes, it's a one-man band, isn't it, Muffin? Yes, one mule band. Sorry.
In the early 50s, when the BBC was a monopoly, you knew, as you left the studios and you saw that blue electronic glare on people's curtains, that they had the television set on and they could have only been watching one thing. That was your show.
Or else they could have dropped off to sleep.
I found 2 statue cleaners from the Ministry of Works giving the king a wash and brush up. And it struck me that they must have a very interesting job.
It was to be a long time before BBC Television abandoned this plodding image. programs were wordy, slow and dull, all tailor-made for family viewing.
Now we ask you to imagine that in 1596, the Elizabethans had a television service of their own. And join us as we put back the clock.
I bid you welcome.
A prime example of what the television critic Peter Black called twee-vie was an entire evening given over to Elizabethan charades.
Mate was gone from the low country with never a penny of money.
So now we will light the fuse.
Bravo. And there is my stew of coney with its rich seasonings, and beside it I will lay a piece of the castle wall.
Rightly is Master Harbour known as the epicure of cooks.
And then, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. A new breed of television man emerged in Lime Grove, and their stamping ground was sport.
Paul and I were known as the
Some brothers, what were they? The Messina brothers.
The Messina brothers, who were, I suppose they were the mafia of the time. And they got up to all kinds of skullduggery, I think in an illegal way. I think a lot of what we did was illegal within BBC terms. I don't think we were breaking laws. For example, we weren't allowed to pay for interviews at that time. Well, I would hate to admit the number of times I paid to get an interview because there was no other way of doing it. And I think we broke all the BBC rules. We must have all been independent thinkers. And in the main, I don't think really gave a damn for anybody. And that's not the usual attitude in the BBC.
Good evening. Welcome to Sportsview. Tonight's program ranges from racing to boxing, from football to skating.
I wrote a memo to Peter Dimmock, who was then the assistant head of outside broadcast, and I suggested to him that we should launch a midweek sports program. And I thought it would be quite a good idea if he himself introduced it, which I thought helped to bring the memo, gave the memo that flavor that was needed.
Good evening. Welcome to Sportsview. This evening, we've sent a mobile unit to Wolverhampton Wanderers, the Football League champions. And to find out what's happening at Wolverhampton tonight, so we can see their training, David Coleman, please come in.
Well, now, what makes the Wolves such a remarkably successful club? What goes on behind the scenes?
Sportsview was the first sports program combined with journalism. It was a journalistic program. I mean, we were trying to beat the newspapers at their own game. We had the advantage of going on the air around 9 o'clock in the evening, and so the newspapers had to follow us instead of the other way around. And I think this is the first time this had really happened in a television program. One of the things that helped put Sportsview on the map early on was Roger Bannister's 4-minute mile at Iffley Road in Oxford. We had a car standing by, and the moment he achieved it, he was put into this car, rushed here to Lime Grove to the studio, and we got him into Sportsview literally in the last 2 minutes of the program. Mind you, Roger Bannister said afterwards he'd never drive in a BBC car again.
Finish with one, in a bit, let's have a bit.
There was something truly pioneering about the program. It was the first magazine program that used all the television techniques that were available at that time. After all, Sportsview was the very first program that used a teleprompter. I mean, Dimmock couldn't have read the scripts if he wouldn't have been able to read it off the teleprompter.
It really began because I went to America, and while I was out there, I saw in the CBS News studio the autocue, which was a typewriter, and the words came up in front of the lens. And I realized how much it improved the speed of programs. You could get in 30 minutes, for example, what would normally take nearly 40 minutes, because your links were so much faster. Well, the BBC couldn't afford to buy it for America at that stage, but we were in the studio, and one of the engineers said, I could make one up for you, Peter. And that meant that you had the script on a roll, which was put on with black felt pen. That then went into the mirror, and then that was reflected onto an angled piece of plain glass between me and the camera. So I could see the script was all pretty Heath Robinson. And then the question was, how do we make the script move in front of the mirror? So we got a mangle, of all things, an ordinary mangle, and turned the handle. And that's how the autocue began in British television.
Dimmock was able to read the script as we were going along, so that was able to give the program the pace.
And now here for his first television interview since he announced his retirement.
We then, when we went to the Saturday afternoon program, we really showed the audience exactly what was happening in the studio. I mean, David Coleman, for example, would never make a secret of the fact that he had a deaf aid in his ear in order to hear the producer, in order to hear the latest sports flash. Peter Dimmock would never worry about whether the telephone was available. The phone would ring in the middle of the program to give him something. Peter would pick up the phone and would give the thing out. So all those things worked and were shown to the audience. Of course, it was a sports program, but above all, it was also a news program.
In most other fields than sport, the same respectable, lifeless programs continued to be churned out, until the mid-50s, when there came the chill wind of competition from the businesslike ITV.
I think his name was Lasky or something like that. He used to sing a song called, what was it, Busy Bee, or Busy Bee, Busy something like that. Anyway, I wonder what became of him. He's not dead, is he?
No, he's not. No, he's not dead, no. Just passed over to the other side. Commercial.
By 1957, well over 70% of the total audiences every night watched ITV. And one of the reasons was that, high-minded though we were, we failed in entertainment. So that on a Saturday night, there was an outside broadcast show called Saturday Night Out.
Outside broadcast. We're starting now.
One didn't know where they were going to go. What you saw was OB vans leaving their garage. Then you cut to where they went, and you saw a visit to a fish curing factory in Grimsby. Now that, on a Saturday night at 8 o'clock, is not exactly what people wanted to see.
With ITV now making the running with light entertainment and news, how was the BBC to respond? The answer was in the field where ITV was weakest, high-quality programs about current affairs. And the person who brought that about was a woman, Mrs. Grace Wyndham Goldie. Grace Wyndham Goldie had been a radio and television critic for The Listener. Now, as assistant head of talks at Lime Grove, she was a terror to all who worked under her, with much the same dogmatic way of expressing herself as Margaret Thatcher, and, like her, a radical who was determined to have her own way.
It's always been one of my personal aims, and indeed one of the reasons why I went into television. I knew that this was going to be an enormously powerful force in the world. So, I thought I would like to have a hand in what it was doing.
I first met her when she came on a trip to Washington, where I was the BBC's news correspondent in those days. Well, then the head of television talks, Mary Adams, was moved, and both Grace and I put in for the job, and it was obviously a close-run thing. I got it, but I was immediately asked if I would like to have her as the assistant head. There wasn't such a job advertised, and if I'd had any sense, if I'd known Grace better, I would have said no, because Grace wasn't designed to be the assistant head of anything.
She had an iron whim, it was once said of her, and it catches the spirit of the woman. She argued to assertion. She would take a position, and you had to find a way of moving her off the position if it was clearly untenable, but without getting involved in a very emotional argument. And it was an acquired skill. It was certainly a survival skill if you were going to work with Grace over any period of time. She could go down half an hour before transmission and say, that was absolutely terrible. Yeah. We've got to do it. We've got to start again. We must begin in the middle or whatever. Yeah. No one else had the nerve to do that. And she used to, in that sense, she used to terrorize the people who worked for her.
Grace's strength lay in an extraordinary flair for picking young men straight out of university and putting them into positions of power. Those like Peacock, Milne and Donald Baverstock, who would all later go on to run the BBC. The three programmes she brought to a high standard of excellence were Panorama, Tonight, and the arts programme Monitor, presented by Hugh Weldon. But it was in the coverage of election programmes that her influence was first felt.
Just 30 minutes ago, the polling stations closed and voting in the general election ended.
Grace believed both that TV had a duty to politicians to present them at their best, and that elections made good television because they were about conflict. She also saw no reason why, if the interest was still there, election results should not continue to be broadcast throughout the night. At the time, a quite revolutionary concept.
Well, we are starting up at 9:15 on polling day. We're going on till 4 in the morning. As you know, results were coming in from up till about 4 o'clock in the morning, and as we feel that this is a service to the public, we shouldn't stop just when we fancy, but we should go on giving them the results up while they're still coming out.
We're having, in fact, cameras in 16 places where counts are taking place, and 20 OB units in all will be covering 28 different places during the 2 days with OBs of all sorts and shapes and sizes.
And at the spider's web centre of it all was the calm, rotund, reassuring figure of Richard Dimbleby.
Here in the Lime Grove studio, we're waiting for the first results. From the first results, we can probably tell, to quite an extent, what is likely to happen in this general election.
He loved doing a programme like the general election, but he was aware that it was risky professionally. And he wrote about one of them, 55 I think it was, that it's generally accepted that half an hour on television is long enough for anybody. And he goes on to say that, you can go on for 3/4 of an hour if you've got something else for people to look at. But the idea of going on for 7 hours, followed by a further programme of another 12 hours, is actually nothing short of lunacy. And he obviously felt that the thing was a great event, but that it was a kind of crazy undertaking the BBC was doing.
Now I think we must go back to Richard Dimbleby in the London studio.
Well, there was our first result, and Butler?
There was a swing to the Conservatives of just over 2%. If every constituency in the country behaves as Cheltenham has done, there will be a majority of about 115 for the Conservatives over Labour.
And now we take you from London straight to Salford.
He had a telephone there sitting in front of him, that old-fashioned black telephone. And people watching this looked at it and thought that they could ring him up. That telephone simply went to the gallery. It was no good at all. The London Exchange got blocked by people doing this because it sort of spread. Everybody saw this telephone, hadn't seen it before. And he had to broadcast things saying, please, this telephone isn't real, and sort of pick it up and show that it wasn't to get people to stop doing it.
And back in the studio here, David Butler wishes to give a short session in swing.
I think it was 3.5 hours ago that Bob Mackenzie said that Labour needed that swing.
An enormous amount of effort went into the visual aids. We tried to make a model of the House of Commons with a ping-pong ball representing every member of Parliament. We tried to make the election a horse race with people going around, the two parties going around the track. We tried various graphical devices, and I find here the whole series of suggestions, most of which were quite impractical, for how you could actually make the thing more vivid. Grace had a deep suspicion she'd once been let down by a magnetic thing on a map which had fallen off on air, and she wouldn't let us have anything magnetic.
We're showing in these results. And I'll be aided by an enormous number of charts and graphs and so on, which we'll be talking to later in the evening.
We now have a technically far more complicated operation. Many, many more cameras, many, many more counts and OBs, much quicker use of information. And finally, our battle is to turn it back into a human programme again. Whereas in those days, I think it had a much more human face. Everybody sat round the studio in Lime Grove chatting, because actually a general election is a great human story.
And there's a special message from me at the end that says, Piers, you must be thirsty. Water.
All demonstrate
Water.
political television, in the general election programme, in the party politicals, in the election broadcasts. These were where people learnt what politicians looked like on the screen, people they didn't know before as human beings.
We have suffered neither a landslide nor a disaster, but a setback.
It was from these walls that they began to know politicians in the very different way they know them now. The British public is much more volatile than it was, the electorate. People switch in by-elections and general elections and opinion polls from side to side much more than they did. I'm quite certain the biggest single factor in explaining that volatility is television.
We are going very shortly to close down. A little snooze for all concerned, and you too, I hope. The service is opening up again at 6:30 in about 2 hours and a half and a bit from now. We ourselves, live, fresh, shaved, suits changed, clean, alert and breakfasted, will be sitting here again at 8 o'clock. Panorama is called the window on the world. I think we must have as much of the world as we can get in it.
Yes, you can't have it both ways. You've got to be topical as well.
Yes.
If we look at next week's program, we've got Africa.
Yes, Robert Key's film is in from Central Africa. And then James Morris is in Edinburgh with the silent camera.
Well, this strange little underlit, overheated room is really, or was at the time, the panorama attic in one of the houses stretching along from the Lime Grove studios, where, when the program first began, we had our weekly script conferences, which we then had on a Friday afternoon.
We were a bit like a game of cricket that was being played for the first time on the beach, and we had to invent the rules for cricket as well as learn how to play the game.
Panorama started as a rag bag of a program of mostly trivial items. It took Grace and Leonard Mile to fashion it into a serious program which people would have to take seriously.
We weren't concerned with informing Westminster about what was going on in the world. We wanted to reach to Wigan. And so the first premise was, nothing must be too long, nothing must bore.
Your Grace, many people in England find it a little hard to understand that an archbishop can be so involved in politics. I wonder if you could explain how that came about.
Well, the Archbishop... There was the civil war raging in Cyprus. We sent Woodrow Wyatt to report on it, and he interviewed Archbishop Macarius, who was then regarded rather as IRA terrorists are regarded now. And Churchill got on to Sir Ian Jacob and told him that he ought to stop this program.
I pointed out to Churchill on the telephone, I said, one mustn't imagine that appearing on television automatically does somebody good. They may expose themselves as being horrors.
Jacob said he was going to have a look at it, and he came down and watched it with me here in Lime Grove. And there came a moment when Woodrow Wyatt asked the Archbishop how he justified being a Christian Archbishop and supporting terrorism. And Macarius gave an extraordinary sort of shifty look out of the corner of his eye, and then gave a bland answer.
Announced the campaign of violence.
I am opposed to the use of violence, but at the same time...
And Jacob said to me afterwards, you know, if I'd just heard that answer on radio or read it in the Times, I would have taken it at its face value. But television gives you a moment of truth you don't get with these other media. And the moment I saw that shifting look out of the corner of his eye, I knew you couldn't trust him an inch. So we'll carry the program. And he rang Churchill up and said we were going to transmit it.
But he was not convinced at all. He just said, Jacob, he said, I never would have believed it of you, and put down the telephone.
Now, the interesting thing was that about a year later, we sent Chris Chataway to interview Macarius in Athens. And Chataway asked him some question about collaborating with the Turkish minority. And once again, Macarius gave this extraordinarily shifty look out of the corner of his eye, and then gave another bland answer. Now, the fact is, on this particular occasion, a little dog walked across the square and started to relieve itself against the Archbishop's foot. Now, where was the moment of television truth?
The Macarius incident was the first of what were to be many rows between the government of the day, whether Labour or Conservative, and the nabobs of Lime Grove. The worst would have come later, but the most immediate was about the Anglo-French invasion of Suez. At that time, and it's hard to believe now, we were not allowed to discuss any political issue within 14 days of it being debated in Parliament. Yet Suez was an issue that bitterly divided the country, and to have ignored it would have been a dereliction of duty. So how did Panorama cope?
Mike had this brilliant idea, let's do a world reaction story on Suez. And we all set off. You were in Australia.
Well, I was running in the Olympic Games.
You were in the Olympics.
Yes.
And you came in with stuff. And we had people all over the world.
It would have been better off doing a panorama at the time.
Yeah, I would, actually, yes.
Well,
I didn't do anything.
You did a piece for us.
Yeah.
And everybody did pieces.
Now, the first angry feeling of dismay over the British invasion of Egypt has more or less died away. But there remains a very strong feeling that we, the British, have done something inept.
There's no doubt whatever as to the Indian reaction to Anglo-French policy in Egypt. It is one of intense disapproval.
It's made us extremely angry and depressed because the act is immoral in itself, and we have associated the name of England with a higher standard of integrity in international affairs.
The world reaction to Suez was totally negative. And this totally negative program went out, and there was a bloody awful row in the House of Commons. The Tory party went absolutely mad.
We felt obliged, obviously, to try and reflect in our programmes the debate that was going on over Suez, the arguments against what we and the French were doing. And of course the Eden government at the time thought this was almost tantamount to treason, that we were undermining what they were doing.
They were all young, they were all active, they were all rebellious. They were all the kind of people that the BBC got terribly worried about later in the 60s. And they were rebellious, and they asked questions. And the programme had a lot of punch in those days.
Is there any colour bar on British Railways?
No, there is no colour bar on British Railways.
On Tuesday, I went to Smithfield. This is Mr. Davis, the goods agent in charge of Smithfield Depot. How many vacancies have you at the moment?
It's 9 vacancies for staff at the moment.
We entered into a piece of deception on the colour bar on British Rail, which I'm not sure would really be allowed now. First of all, interviewed the manager at I think it was Euston.
It was a goods yard.
That's right. Yeah. And he said, no, absolutely no colour bar at all. No, unthinkable. And then we sent down an obviously presentable black chap who applied for the job.
They were turned down. And I learnt that to them it was no new experience.
I went to the manager and asked for if he needed any porter. He told me that there was no vacancy for no porter.
So then we went back in again and said to the manager, what about it?
Now, Mr. Davis, you have vacancies here.
Oh, yes.
But now 4 coloured men came this morning to ask for jobs and they were turned away. Why was that?
I see.
Now, officially, the policy is that there's no colour bar.
That got a lot of criticism. I mean, that was reckoned to be very dirty reporting indeed.
With these coloured chaps.
The other current affairs programme which Grace and Leonard helped to build up was the popular long-running Tonight, edited by Donald Baverstock. In Panorama, we used to be slightly condescending towards Tonight, the froth as we saw it on top of Panorama's solid 4X.
Good evening. One of the critics of this programme was nice enough to say the other day that Tonight introduces its viewers to some of the more unusual things that go on in the world.
I recognized in them a kind of peculiar quality of human existence and a recognition of their attitude to life, which they were prepared to express in terms of a visual as well as an oral medium.
Dance hall, Saturday night. I've been caught round the wrong side of the desk. I'll see you around the other side. I've got to come here to say goodnight. I've got a button. And she died yesterday, aged 77. An egg. Just one solitary egg.
Egg and chips, chop and chips, ham and chips, sausage and chips, fish and chips, beans and chips, egg, bacon and chips, tongue and chips, pie and chips. And then at the bottom, in very large letters, chips.
The Tonight Show, which was totally surprising. very largely irreverent, producing totally new conventions, actually tethered an audience's attention between 6 and 7 in the evening, so that between 57 and 60, the BBC recaptured a great deal of the audience again.
Well, tonight we're going to meet, among other people, a smoking dog called Butch and a horse racing butcher called Bacon. And we'll be looking round the northeast, southwest and the Midlands. Now let's look in the direction of Cy Grant.
Heartache today for the depths delights. No more of those glamorous nights.
We could not bear the thought of boring the pants off the audience by taking things too earnestly every night. We didn't really have anything to say to the audience. We had questions to ask. Every so often we had to laugh at the crazy world.
They've got a keyboard up here which they can use to play the bells with too. Let's have a look. You've just got to touch one of these notes, I'm told, ever so lightly, and boing.
With that, good night, and don't forget to see you tonight on Monday night. Good night.
"7:30 a.m. A member of the Tonight team keeps abreast of the news.
We'd get in about 9:30 and we'd look at what we'd got. We had basically 40 minutes to fill and basically nothing to put in it.
9:30 a.m. The production team discusses an item for possible inclusion in tonight's programme.
We would have got,
Yep.
for instance, Robert Key in
Right.
to talk about
Lumumba, absolutely,
because he
yes.
was the first person to ever meet him.
Quite right, yes.
Bush babies vanished from zoo cage.
Oh, yes.
We'd have got a bush baby.
A bush baby in the studio.
You would have done. I
On the
would
nature
have
of bush
done.
babies.
Yes.
It was also very important to try and balance, obviously, you know, the heavyweight material with the lighter weight.
10 o'clock. All adjourn to the canteen to discuss progress over a coffee.
I always thought of Tonight as a kind of hunting band. I mean, the hunt is deep in the human genes and psyche. It's a daily task. You go out in the morning, you come back with the carcass in the evening, or you don't. And Tonight was a bit like that.
Lime Grove was immensely competitive. One is always thinks in television of competition between the BBC and ITV. But the competition between the BBC and ITV was nothing as compared to the competition between different programs. They were so sharp, the competition between Panorama and Tonight, for example. Spies were sent, usually assistant film editors, from one cutting room to the other in order to see what one was doing or the other was doing. And Tonight in particular had the theory that they could do in 3 minutes what the documentaries could do only in 50 minutes. So that, for example, when it came to showing The Birth of a Baby, which the then science producer had got in a film, the editor of Tonight procured a Danish Birth of a Baby and showed that at 7 o'clock.
We had our leader, and that was Donald, you know, our grubby, exuberant leader, who we shouted at and argued with, but who we followed, you know, with our heads down and our striding through the mire. We were a sort of little band apart, with a kind of crusade to do the thing in this new land of television that we thought was the right way it should go.
11 o'clock. A Tonight film unit samples people's opinions on the street.
We did what we'd call a vox pop, where you just want to go out and say, what do people feel about this?
Do you often eat haggis?
Well, I did at one time, but now I've just stopped it now.
You wouldn't talk to them about big issues like, do you think we ought to join the European Monetary Union or anything like that?
Well, it got such a hold on me that I had to lay off it. I just couldn't work unless I had some haggis.
You might talk to them about whether Pit Bull Terrier should be put down or just licensed, something that their view is as good as anybody else's on.
Excuse me, are you worried about anything in your life?
Yes, getting married.
What's worrying about that?
I don't want to get too tied down.
What, are you getting married to each other, are you?
Yes, obviously. Well, I'm the comedian on the local operatic society.
What's worrying about that?
Well, people come in the shop and they expect me to be funny off the stage as well as on.
What is it that worries you?
Well, my holidays, where I'm going to go for my holidays.
Well, how do they worry you?
Well, I always have to go to Wales every year.
12:30. It's tiring work writing a script for the Tonight programme.
Tonight was radical in a tradition of English journalism that goes from Cobbett to Cudlip to Picture Post. There was a period in the history of the Daily Mirror when it was very serious and very populist at the same time, and Tonight tried to capture that flavour.
This man was a friendly face among you, mixing freely with the crowd which a cricket game had brought together. He shared cigarettes and a scorecard with an English couple who sat beside him. He was neat, clean, wholly acceptable as your neighbour.
We created a language,
And now he has chosen
not just a visual language, but a language in commentary, which was understood by a school leaver of 16 and was not despised by a university graduate at 24. Now, this was a very rare achievement. You've got to bear in mind that the press is deeply class-ridden and divided between the quality press and the tabloids. And they've never, ever found a language which would be equally understood by a school leaver and by a university graduate.
No one knows how many yards of sweat make up the nation's linen, but several black hands are busy with the job of keeping Britain white.
We were not constructed by God to take in words through our eyes. We were made to take in pictures through the eyes and words through the ears. And television suddenly liberated you to talk to people like that, to say, look at the pictures and listen to the words. And at that level, rather than having to read acres of small print, people would be interested in all sorts of things, we felt, and things that were not thought of as general popular television.
Meanwhile, in Mexico, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. Reporter Alan Wicker braves the heat to do a piece to camera.
A sleepy Mexican fishing village, where time moves imperceptibly from fiesta to fiesta. The month when the Arabs spend their days fasting and their nights feasting.
A brash, air-conditioned nightmare where we wait forever under neon for a jackpot that never turns up.
I think the important thing in those days was that all of us had had a life before television. After us, you had people like David Frost, let's say, enormously talented and experienced television man, but a television animal. That the next generation were television creatures.
4 o'clock. The all-important questions for tonight's interview are mulled over.
ITN are great ones for claiming nowadays, and Robbie Day in particular, they invented proper questions. I don't believe that for a second, actually. We did.
If this score sits on the piano, is there some point at which you can just form a chord and say, look, this, I feel, is the sort of music that I would write and no one else? Possibly because I'm now in America, possibly because I'm reflecting American
Well, now
people,
you're putting
possibly
words
because
in
I'm
my
married.
now you're putting words in my mouth.
Tonight was the first program that really worried about questions, that paid all the respect that is due to an interviewer's questions, that we worked on. Otherwise, the interviewer had gone into the studio with a few notes written on his hand, and interviews were regarded as fillers. For tonight, it was the crux and the peak.
Can we?
I've been through them.
How do you know them?
I know them off by heart.
Yeah, good.
I bet you when he goes
She not only
through
knows
them,
the
he finds
questions, she knows the answers.
You know, it's very easy to answer questions if you're bold and easy, kind of half volley, to hit it straight back. But if you actually have to stop and think, then that in itself makes fascinating television. The thought process going on.
How much, Mr. Isagonis, do you dictate to us what we want? How much do we dictate to you what we want? Who dominates? Does the designer dominate the buyer, or does the buyer dominate the designer?
Living in, the butterfly world of pop as a Beatle, do you find that this undermines people's serious acceptance of you as a writer?
If there was one gesture you could make to show the personification of unconquerable ineffectuality, what would that be?
How long have you got now?
About 32 minutes, something like that.
Yes, but we need one. Well, we need an extra 5, maybe an extra 6, because we don't. None of this will extend.
No, that's true enough.
Have you any ideas, Derek?
6:05. From Studio H, Lime Grove, Tonight transmits to 8 million people.
Now we'll bid you good night. The next Tonight will be tomorrow night. Good night. Yes, I do think we were arrogant. I think there were occasions when we were, yes, rather above our station.
Arrogant? Were we arrogant? I'm afraid we probably were, yes. We wouldn't have thought of it as arrogant. We would have said we were confident. But there, I mean, one of the things that united us, and does with a lot of groups, I think, more than admit it, was the feeling that we were really good.
I remember the most satisfactory letter that arrived at Tonight office that was from a viewer who said, "Why isn't Tonight running the country?" And I think we also felt that the viewer probably had a point.
In the early 60s, the bulk of BBC television moved out of Lime Grove, leaving current affairs in sole charge. For us in Panorama, it was a golden period, crisscrossing the world to bring back world stories, covering important international events live by satellite, welcoming the great and the good into the studios each Monday evening. We had a steady audience of 8 million, and were in some danger of getting swollen-headed.
The Prime Minister answers questions from London, Paris and New York on Britain's decision to apply once again for membership of the European Common Market. Facing him in the London studio,
in the Panorama studio now, the Right Honourable Edward Heath on this week's Tory conference.
Tonight, the stormiest session ever of the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference has ended. In 24 hours, the man at the centre of the storm.
I've never felt so powerful as at the age of 29, having the whole of 24 hours at my disposal. I mean, I didn't really feel that there was any Prime Minister or President in the world who had as much direct power as I did. There was plenty of money. The budget was quite adequate. You had I think there were 5 film crews who could be sent anywhere in the world to cover anything. Anyone picking up a telephone would be at one's disposal. It was a wonderful moment. It was a wonderful moment in, it seemed to me at the time, the history of the world.
President Johnson had some news for us too.
24 hours talks to President of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda.
Now Mr. James Callaghan is giving up as Chancellor to become Home Secretary.
Lime Grove produced good journalism that was independent and considered. Its fault was, it began to feel, I think, that it could take on politics, that these people here at Lime Grove were superior to the politicians in their nasty humdrum world, pleasing and pandering to the electors.
May I put the problem in a slightly different way, Prime Minister?
As soon as you confront party politicians, as soon as you take on the Labour Party or the Conservative government, then you've had it, because they're going to fight back, and they're going to fight dirty, and they're going to shatter this myth of aloofness. So that was the mistake. It became too arrogant.
In the Panorama studio, Mr. Edward Heath, Leader of the Opposition. With me to question him, James Mossman and Robert McNeill.
In the mid-60s, Ted Heath came into Lime Grove and they put on a film which, it was at the height of his unpopularity and the depth of his unpopularity.
He may not have demonstrated as much power as he ought to have done. I know he's a brilliant man, but he's yet got to show that power of leadership.
They then asked him questions about it, and it really looked like bear baiting.
How low does your personal rating among your own supporters have to go before you consider yourself a liability to the party you lead?
Well, popularity isn't everything. In fact, it isn't the most important thing. What matters is doing what you believe to be right.
soon hardly a month passed without rows between Lime Grove and the BBC governors, or Lime Grove and the government of the day, whatever its colour. One of the most bitter resulted from David Dimbleby's satirical documentary on the Labour opposition. He called it Yesterday's Men.
Humpty Dumpty, he sat on a wall, giving the orders, and then, in the midst of it all, he had a great fall. Now he's one of yesterday's men.
Yesterday's Men was an idea I had in the bath, to make a film about what it was like to be out of office, because Labour had suddenly been thrown out in 1970.
One of yesterday's men, yesterday's man, and it's no fun at all, getting sacked and put out to grey.
We talked to people for a long time and cut them down very fine, which they knew would happen.
I think you adjust very quickly. If you're in politics, you expect to have periods on the government side and periods on the opposition side.
Oh, I think, yes, great humiliation. It was very unexpected, certainly to me, and I don't believe anybody who says they expected it.
It was a sudden turnaround of expectation, and I wouldn't deny for a moment that an hour before...
What they didn't know was the title, Yesterday's Men, which was their own political slogan turned back on them, because we thought we could get away with using it like a headline in a newspaper article, where you write the article and then you put any headline over it. And that was, I think, a bit naive of us. So they didn't know that. And they didn't know that the Scaffold was going to be commissioned to write a little ditty called We're Yesterday's Men and It's No Fun at All. But actually within that, the way the programme was constructed, as a reflection of their opinion, was absolutely objective and fair.
Only Harold Wilson became richer in opposition. Using his privileged access to government papers, he wrote 300,000 words in 6 months about Labour's time in office.
But if we had been able to stop the programme, certainly we would have. Indeed, if I'd had the materials, I would have blown up the studio myself. It was a disgrace. I mean, that should never be forgotten, that it was the most deceitful episode in the BBC's political history.
Here they are today.
The only reason it got into difficulties was Harold Wilson objected me asking him about why he was writing a book and earning a great deal of money from it instead of getting on with organising the Labour Party in opposition, which is what all or many of his own colleagues had been complaining about to me. So it was a perfectly legitimate question to put, but somehow it touched a raw nerve.
Why did you think people would be interested in reading about your years in office? Is it proper for a man who hopes one day again to be Prime Minister to write in the way that you have, in particular about the civil service?
It eventually culminated in a row in Harold Wilson's room between Dimbleby and Wilson over the question of Wilson's money, how much money he had, how much he had got for his book. Wilson said, I'm not going to have any more of this. You don't ask Heath questions about his yacht. The filming was stopped by me. I think some lessons were learned, though obviously David Dimbleby did well out of it. He's still with you. He should have been sent to a desert island without his 8 records as consolation.
To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die.
It has all the symptoms of a love letter from a betrayed girlfriend, because current affairs journalists felt a great surge of hope and expectation in '64 when the Labour Party was elected. Things were going to change. And I think television journalists who'd felt as a group that a new dawn was coming and they were going to be part of the new elite guiding this society felt betrayed by the politicians. But it really was born of superiority, which I think could only have been bred in these closed, claustrophobic confines of the Lime Grove bunker.
Yesterday's Men wasn't the end of an era, no, it was potentially the beginning of an era that we never saw, I think.
Yesterday we were front page news. Now there's only the past to confront us. There's only the past to confront us.
What it did was to be more outspoken, and that led to the politicians deciding that this medium of television, if it had that kind of power, if it could do that kind of, have that kind of impact on the way people thought, had to be reined back, had to have guy ropes put up and be held down to the ground.
But yesterday's Men was only the beginning. Even more serious were the rows about programmes on Northern Ireland. When I was asked to chair a 2-hour debate on the province, the government was so frightened by the mayhem they thought might ensue, they asked the BBC governors to call it off. The governors refused. Much speculation and some misunderstanding about the nature of the programme you are about to see. There was no mayhem. Indeed, it was a very dull programme, and within a few days it was forgotten. But more rows followed, and politicians whose opinions television had once done so much to promote now contracted out.
Lime Grove was the cockpit. It used to be the arena where politics and television came together.
During this election, I found that the voters, while they are preoccupied, naturally enough.
To start with, of course, the politicians, they were very afraid of television. In the late 50s, they adjusted to the fact that television was important.
But I was trying to forget all this.
In the 60s, the politicians accepted that broadcasting was part of the Fourth Estate and had its own constitutional independence.
I've had criticism all through my political life.
But they've now become so clever at using television.
No, I'm not answering any questions about...
So adroit at rephrasing the question, at ignoring the question and giving their own answer.
You did say you had no intention of putting up prescription charges.
Let me give you the question and the answer, not interpretations.
They're now able to control the end product of television to a far greater extent than has ever been the case up to now.
What has happened over the years is that the politicians, I mean, they've all surrounded themselves with things called spin doctors and minders and hairdressers and heaven knows what else, and that they therefore wish to treat with television, and indeed with the press and the radio for that matter, on their own terms. And by on their own terms, it means that they are not as anywhere near as freewheeling or happy to come in and have on camera the sort of frank arguments which one knows they have in the tea rooms of the House of Commons.
It's a part of the political power game, and certainly part of the tradition of this building, that the worlds of politics and the media should clash, the one endeavouring to present itself to the electorate in the best possible light, the other never prepared to accept such claims uncritically. Perhaps it is right that this story of Lime Grove should end with the tale of Mrs. Thatcher and Mrs. Gould and the sinking of the Belgrano.
Time for us now to go nationwide with Sue Lawley, a very special edition with the Prime Minister on the spot.
There was in the 1983 election an incident which I think symbolised something of where the relationship between the politicians and the broadcasters had got to when Mrs. Thatcher came to Lime Grove for the On the Spot programme.
Good evening. Nationwide tonight is the general election campaign.
Mrs. Thatcher had learnt many of the techniques of television and many of the techniques of the interviewers, and went in a great deal for controlled media appearances like photo opportunities. And interviewing Mrs. Thatcher had become a bit like professional wrestling. You sort of thought that you saw a lot of blood and you heard a lot of groans, but actually it was tomato ketchup on the floor. She'd learnt many of the techniques of the interviewers.
We've been asking for questions over the past 2 weeks.
The basic idea was, here was a chance for the audience, from regional studios or from the Lime Grove studio, to ask questions of the Prime Minister.
Then that
we selected very carefully the people who'd written in, making sure they were relatively tough-minded and articulate. And we said, listen, ask a supplementary. Don't simply ask your question and sit back. Keep going at the Prime Minister.
Her questioner was a Mrs. Diana Gould, who, with the persistence denied to the professional interviewer, refused to take no for an answer.
Mrs. Gould, your question, please.
Mrs. Thatcher, why, when the Belgrano, the Argentinian battleship, was outside the exclusion zone and actually sailing away from the Falklands, why did you give the orders to sink it?
But it was not sailing away from the Falklands. It was in an area which was a danger to our ships.
Mrs. Thatcher, you started your answer by saying it was not sailing away from the Falklands. It was on a bearing of 280, and it was already west of the Falklands. So I'm sorry, but I cannot see how you can say it was not sailing away from the Falklands.
When it was sunk.
When it was sunk.
It was a danger to our ships.
No, but you have just said at the beginning of your answer that
And this grey-haired geography mistress started harrying her and asking her questions and persisting in questions in a way that Mrs. Thatcher was completely caught by surprise. No television interviewer would have dared to use the techniques that Mrs. Gould used on Mrs. Thatcher. She didn't know which direction Mrs. Gould was coming from, and Mrs. Gould drew real blood.
Danger to our ships.
Mrs. Thatcher, I am saying that it was on a bearing 280, which is a bearing just north of west. It was already west of the Falklands, and therefore nobody with any imagination can put it sailing other than away from the Falklands.
I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Mrs. Gould. I think seeing it, you do see that she does look as if she's getting a bit het up, but her voice doesn't show it so much, I don't think, and of course I could only hear her, I couldn't see her.
When it was sunk, it was in an area which was a danger to our ships.
Well,
now, you accept that, do you?
No, I
Well,
don't.
I'm sorry, it was.
I had nothing to lose. I mean, it wasn't my job. I wasn't a professional interviewer. I was completely unknown. I think it was much easier for me to do it than it would have been for a professional, but I do wish some professionals would do it a bit more.
Well, when I came down from the studio gallery here, I was delighted with the programme. It seemed to me to be democracy in action, one iron lady taking on another. But I was a little bit concerned about what would happen on the studio floor. When I came through, Mrs. Thatcher was already deep in conversation with Sir Gordon Rees and other of her supporters. But they were all reassuring her. No, Margaret, you've done very well indeed. Went very well. She was looking slightly quizzically, but no, they said it was excellent. And then we headed downstairs to hospitality. I had a sort of feeling that the reaction downstairs there would be rather different. Well, it was a fairly silent walk along the corridor here to the hospitality room where Mrs. Thatcher's entourage was waiting for her. Dennis, Carol, and one or two others. And she walked through the door here, and I didn't think she knew what to expect. But when she saw their faces, there was no question mark. They thought it was a disgrace. For the first time, they thought she wasn't in charge during the election campaign. And Carol thought it was a perfect example of crass mischief and ineptitude by the BBC. After a period, it seemed like more than 20 seconds and 20 minutes, they were off into the car park and speeding away from a place they clearly thought was run by people who, at the very best, were liberal, and probably worse than that.
Not surprisingly, this was the last time the Prime Minister visited Lime Grove.
There's something that's missing, I think, that when this place was in its innocence, dreaming up how it could serve democracy by commenting on politics, that it thought it could do, and it's really discovered now that it can't really do. It can't play quite the full role that it had hoped to play, and instead is playing a much more ordered, structured approach to politics, which is fine, but it's that little bit of spice, I think, sometimes missing.
Lime Grove was always a place of historic firsts. What you're about to see now is an historic last. Over on this wall here, amidst the spaghetti harvest of wires, is a plug connected to this Late Show camera. And when I put it out, you will see the last image to come from the Lime Grove studios splutter, fade, and die. The next tonight will be tomorrow night, but only for the ghosts of programmes past.
This is the BBC television service. Good evening. Once again, we have a few moments in hand before the next program, which gives us a chance to look at this interesting clock logo. Not to be outdone by the solely logo department, the BBC Clocks Workshop has been ticking away to produce this highly interesting pop art specimen entitled Imminently 8 with Parallel Scratches.
Hi there, spookaroonies everywhere. Well, people that like to be spooked saw many programs over the years from Limey Grove. People have been frightened all over the country by their programs. Well, you know, up as far as Scotland and down as far as Brighton, basically. Doctor Who frightened a large number of people all over the country, but most importantly, I'd say in the north and the Midlands here, basically, but all over. The Daleks particularly loomed into people's nightmares in Crystal Palace. A lot of people actually moved up to Manchester as a result of being frightened by Daleks. But I have to say our next program, Quatermass, was responsible for major terror and panic all over the place. So what I'd say is if you're going to watch this program, close your eyes first.